I'd like to start by sharing excerpts from a poem by Dane Kotler called "The Shofar Breaks Your Heart." When you give a girl a shofar, don't make it easy. Put it up on the shelf in the living room where its curled promise of a shout will tempt her until she can reach it on tiptoe. Tell her no one has ever found its voice, that she will make it grunt, bray, and sputter like the animal it came from. Then give her a few years. Give her an empty garage and a neighborhood Jewish enough to understand what it's hearing, so that she can practice until tiny tikkiot burst forth from this scrap of a ram. She will be the only one who can ever shape its sounds, can bend the call to tekiah, round off 9 drops of truah wailing, fling the anguished cry of a shvarim from its mouth. Let her begin to understand that she is holding a living prayer. Teach her. After every blast, you can hear the echo. When it's over, close your eyes. Be broken here, before God and your people. Be cracked. Feel the light and the words come in. We don't need the shofar to break us this year. We are cracked wide open. But how our hearts need that young child. With the year that we've had, you may have come here today to hear one of the following 2 sermons. Maybe you came for the solidarity sermon. The most salient image in your mind is of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv over these past few days. Sirens blaring, bombs exploding, friends and family hiding in their safe rooms. The sermon you need to hear is that we must unite unquestioningly behind Israel. Our enemies are real and dangerous. This is no time for uncertainty or weakness. The only choice is to stand with Israel as it is attacked, provoked, and delegitimized. Could there be any doubt after nearly 200 ballistic missiles came from Iran? Israel does the world's dirty work without so much as a word of thanks, and much of the critique against Israel is misguided. There's not one people on the planet who would simply accept the trauma that Israel has endured or the danger that remains. Or maybe you came to hear the humanity sermon. The salient image in your mind is Gaza, flattened to the ground, thousands upon thousands dead unnecessarily, entire villages and families wiped off the face of the earth. Yes, terrorism must be stopped, but the majority of those affected were not terrorists. In addition, the root of the conflict is at least in part caused by Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, which it appears will never end. The current government is so arrogant and reckless that it is no longer worthy of our unquestioning solidarity. Critique of Israel is the only way forward. We can only clean up our side of the street, and we must. I simply cannot bring myself to give either of those sermons today, not in their entirety, even though I agree with much of what would be in both of them. The only sermon I can give today is the conflicted sermon, because I have spent this entire year being profoundly conflicted. I have felt all of the following things this year. Stopped cold by the enormity of the grief heaped upon Israel and the Jewish people. Shocked by the magnitude of cruelty perpetrated on October 7th, the abject brutality. Vengeful. The first time I went to Israel this year, as survivors told their stories, afraid that no one would believe them. Crushed, as peaceniks described the sense that their peace activism had been beaten out of them. I have felt heartsick over the unspeakable suffering in Gaza and defensive of Israel for fighting back and at the same time suspicious all year long that all that killing will make anyone feel better. Also astounded that anti-Semitism has reared its ugly head in so many corners. I felt outraged during my trip to Israel, along with the thousands who were taking, my third trip to Israel, with the thousands who were taking to the streets because they want their babies, the hostages, home. And ashamed over the abuse and neglect that continue in the West Bank. And pessimistic as I've heard from people who are thinking of leaving, not because of external threats to their safety, but because they cannot support the government. And angry that Netanyahu bows to right-wing extremists, leading us all to the brink with aggression and warmongering. And also grateful that Hassan Nasrallah is no longer terrorizing Israel and violently suppressing opposition in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. I felt frightened for what's coming next, worried sick for Israel and for all of us, and also open to the possibility that this will go differently than what our worst fears predict. I can't boil the events of this past year down to a single response or a party line. I can't tell just one story. Anytime a complex and multifaceted reality is reduced to a singular narrative, it becomes flat, mythical. And anytime the parties involved insist that theirs is the only story that can be told, the result is dysfunction, mistrust, silencing of other voices. I would rather be precise and nuanced, even though it's tempting to plant myself in one camp or the other. I would rather be open and honest when we talk with each other, even though it means that we will all be challenged and hear things we don't really want to hear. Let's go back to 1948. The founding of the State of Israel was a miracle for the Jewish people, a much-needed miracle. The world had proven itself beyond any doubt unwilling or unable to keep the Jewish people safe. Following failures across the globe to protect Jews, an army that was young, scrappy, and hungry took on the forces of 5 established countries and miraculously won. For the first time in 2,000 years, Jews near and far had a place to call home. Israel has since then enacted many miracles. The Six-Day War, Entebbe, Operation Solomon, the Startup Nation, field hospitals around the world before anybody else even gets to the disaster site. And so many miracles. The miracle story of the State of Israel is true. And it's also not the only story. Israel is a complex and multifaceted reality. There are those who see us as David and those who see us as Goliath, and most of the time, we're probably not exactly either. So we spend a lot of time defending ourselves against those who insist we are a Philistine giant. And then we wrestle amongst ourselves over which character we're playing. And on both fronts, the only way to win seems to be to scream louder, with more righteous indignation, and with more shame for those who disagree. There has to be another way. Jewish wisdom, after all, is dynamic. It changes. The Torah is chock full of contradictions. Bible scholar Robert Alter argues that this is a deliberate way to convey a richer and more textured story. He writes, "The decision to place in sequence 2 ostensibly contradictory accounts of the same event is equivalent to the technique of post-cubist painting that gives us, for example, a profile and a frontal perspective of the same face. Think of a Picasso painting from his Cubism period. Guernica, for example. We see multiple viewpoints of the same figures at the same time. It's the same method through which the Torah comes to tell us in the same parsha, there will be no needy among you, and there will never cease to be needy among you. They're both true in different ways. Our tradition teaches that repentance and forgiveness are always possible, except when they're not. And that honesty is always the best policy, except when it's not. The Talmud, too, is full of holy and opposing opinions. That's why it takes up an entire bookshelf. It records the words of great sages who vehemently disagree with one another. It preserves unpopular opinions. It even has a category for those arguments that we humans simply cannot resolve. We'll just have to wait for some force larger and wiser than we are to get the right answer. It models strategies like self-critique, giving the best possible read to the opposing side, and staying in the conversation until the most precise nuance is reached. Above all, the Talmud is a conversation, which at the end of the day is what I'm calling for today. No one can think through these impossible questions on our own. That's why we have Chavruta, study partners. We cannot come to moral clarity with only one perspective. When it comes to determining Israel policy, Israelis get to speak first. The distance between the Gaza border and Kfar Aza is about the distance from here to the Hollywood Bowl. So Israelis get to speak first, and Israelis get to speak last. And in the middle, diaspora Jews, American Jews, we need a seat at the table. We are deeply invested in Israel in a great many ways, and we need to be in the conversation. I'm inviting you into a conversation starting on Yom Kippur afternoon, and there will be other opportunities. We will hold carefully guided conversations about Israel. If you need for everyone in the room to agree with you, maybe skip it. But if you want to share and listen and learn, please join us. We won't solve this in 1 hour, but we'll take a first step. Is real conversation possible in contentious times like ours? It has to be. There's a story I hold as the very model of a difficult and honest conversation. It comes from 1948, the year of the founding of Israel. It gives some context to why our miracle was at the very same time someone else's catastrophe. Israel was fighting for its very existence. Remember, it was young, scrappy, and hungry. There was passion and zeal, and sometimes the newly empowered soldiers went overboard. In at least 2 cases, many unarmed non-combatants were murdered brutally, and no one wanted to talk about it. The great poet Natan Alterman published a poem in Davar, the labor movement's newspaper, that was a scathing critique of those murders. In the poem, he describes the clash between a young soldier's impulsive aggression and a frightened old man, head in his hands, whose blood splatters on the wall behind him. Alterman then names all the reasons that Israelis will be told not to discuss this matter publicly. It will weaken us. It was just kids who hadn't yet learned to control themselves, and so on. And he takes those arguments down one by one. They are excuses for hiding the truth, he says. And he ends the poem with a call for justice. David Ben-Gurion was prime minister at the time. He was also the minister of defense and the head of Mapai, the political party that owned that newspaper. Ben-Gurion had both the ability and the motivation to get Alterman, the poet, fired. It was the obvious choice for a leader who needed unity at a precarious time. But here's the letter that Ben-Gurion wrote. Dear Alterman, Yasher Koach for the moral authority and the strength of expression in your last column in Davar. You became the mouthpiece, a pure and true voice for human conscience. I am asking your permission to print this column and distribute it to every soldier in Israel. With gratitude and appreciation, David Ben-Gurion. Without backing down in the least on the need to establish a safe and secure Israel, he printed 100,000 copies and distributed them. That's how it's supposed to go. Self-critique, giving the best possible read to the opposing side, and staying in the conversation. Back to that little girl, stretching up to the shelf until she is just tall enough on her tippy toes to get that shofar. She's going to learn from us what it is to have a broken, shattered heart. She's going to learn that we cry and we pray and we hold each other and we do the work. And that we have real, honest, difficult conversations that will always serve to make us better. That's how we survive. Because we're going to leave the state of Israel for her in all of its perfections and with every one of its miracles. Shana Tova.